In the beginning, there was no light. There was no cycle. There was no time in any meaningful sense, only an eternal, unchanging darkness that had never known the possibility of change. This was the Age of Ancients, when the great dragons ruled a world that was essentially dead despite its existence. The dragons were not tyrannical or cruel in any traditional sense. They were simply the only beings in a world that could not support anything else, a reality so perfectly balanced in stasis that growth, transformation, and meaning had no place to take root. This primordial darkness represents a philosophical state that predates existence itself, if we understand existence as requiring temporality and change. In a world without time, without the ability to become something other than what you are, life cannot truly live. The dragons were eternal not because they achieved enlightenment or immortality, but because they existed in a moment that never passed, an eternal now that contained no dawn, no dusk, and no possibility of either. They did not fear death because death requires time to arrive. They could not hope for change because change requires the passage of moments. They were prisoners in paradise, masters of a kingdom that was fundamentally empty. The fog that surrounded this ancient world was not merely weather or atmosphere. It was the visual manifestation of a reality that had not yet been born into temporal existence. Fog obscures, blurs the boundaries between things, and prevents clear delineation. In this ancient age, the boundaries between being and non-being were similarly obscured. The world itself seemed to dream rather than exist, caught in a sleep from which it could not wake. Then came a change that would reshape everything. The first flame kindled. According to the game's narrative, found through environmental storytelling and item descriptions as the player pieces together the lore, this flame appeared somewhere in the world, bringing with it not only light, but the possibility of time itself. The flame was not created by the dragons. It simply emerged, and with it came everything that came after. This could be understood philosophically as the introduction of temporality into a static universe, the moment when eternal stasis was shattered by the possibility of change. The first flame brought several fundamental forces into being simultaneously. It brought fire, yes, but also the concept of dark. These are not simply opposites, though they are complementary. Fire represents the active principle, the force of becoming, change, and transformation. Where the first flame touched the world, things began to change, to move, to become what they were not. Dark, by contrast, is more subtle. Dark is not the absence of fire, but rather represents the deep wells of potential that remain untouched by the flame's transformative touch. Dark is what fire has not yet changed, what remains in the state of possibility. With the first flame came another gift, and perhaps a curse. Souls appeared. The game's entire structure revolves around souls as experience points, as currency, as the measure of one's existence. Souls in the Dark Souls universe are fragments of the first flame itself, sparks of becoming that allow beings to have identity, will, and the capacity to change. Without souls, a being has no nature, no ability to affect the world, and no meaningful existence. Souls are what makes you yourself rather than merely a part of the undifferentiated background of existence. The emergence of the first flame fundamentally restructured reality. Those beings closest to the flame received the greatest gifts and the greatest burdens. The original lords, as the lore describes them, found pieces of the flame and claimed them as their own. Nito, the first of the dead, claimed a soul of a great soul related to death itself. The Witch of Izlith and her daughters found a flame and began to spread it, nurturing it like a precious child. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, seized a powerful soul of a giant and became the warrior king who would rule an age. These lords were not necessarily virtuous or wise. They were simply those who found the flame and took what they could grasp. This represents a profound philosophical statement about the nature of creation and divinity. The world is not created by benevolent design, but rather shaped by those powerful enough to claim pieces of the creative force. The gods, if we can call them that, are not transcendent beings who existed before time, but rather beings who are lucky, strong, or cunning enough to grasp fragments of the newly emerged first flame. Divinity in Dark Souls is not about goodness or justice, but about proximity to power. The gods are gods not because they deserve to be, but because they seized what became power before others could. With this came the Age of Fire, which would last as long as the flame burned strong. The Age of Fire was marked by the rule of Gwyn and his knights, the establishment of kingdoms, the birth of art and culture, and the illusion that this new order was permanent and natural. But this is crucial to understanding the philosophy of Dark Souls. Even as the Age of Fire began, its ending was already written into its very nature. A fire that burns will eventually burn down. An age that was born must eventually die. The triumph of Gwyn and his kin contained within it the seeds of its own inevitable decline. The flame brought more than just opportunity. It brought hierarchy, scarcity, and struggle. In the Age of Ancients, there was no real conflict because there was no desire, no wanting, no preference for one state over another. But with the flame came desire. Beings could now want things. They could want power, dominion, love, meaning. They could want to preserve their existence or expand it. This desire created the conditions for conflict. The ancient peace of the world before the flame was not a utopia of harmony, but a prison of meaninglessness. The flame freed the world from that prison and condemned it to struggle. This also brought the fundamental inequality that would define all ages that follow. Not all beings were equally close to the flame. Not all beings could grasp equally large pieces of its power. Humans in the lore were particularly notable because they were born outside the reach of the flame's light. They appeared as strange, diminished beings carrying small fragments of humanity like embers within themselves. This is not a flaw in them, but rather a particular nature. Humanity in Dark Souls is not the opposite of divinity, but rather a different relationship to it. Humans carry pieces of the dark within themselves, possibilities that have not yet been set by the flame's transformative touch. The introduction of the flame was thus both salvation and damnation. It freed the world from the prison of stasis, but at the cost of creating time, desire, conflict, and eventual decay. The dragons, though displaced from their dominance, could not truly understand or appreciate this change. They were creatures of the eternal moment, and now they found themselves pushed toward the margins of a new world that valued change above all else. Some would resist this new age. Some would attempt to preserve the ancient world. But resistance would prove futile, because the flame had been introduced and with it time itself could not be reversed. In understanding the first flame, we encounter a fundamental insight about Dark Souls philosophy. Existence itself, temporal existence with change and growth and the possibility of meaning, requires sacrifice. The Age of Fire was an age of light, dominion, culture, and achievement. But it was an age built on the displacement of the ancient order and the inevitable knowledge that it would not last. To exist in time is to move toward ending. To desire is to risk loss. To live is to accept that life is temporary. The game asks the player, knowing that this fire will inevitably burn down, knowing that every age must end, is it worth kindling? Is it worth continuing the cycle of fire and dark, given that fire cannot burn forever? This question, seemingly about the game's ending and the player's ultimate choice, is actually a question about the value of existence itself. Is a temporary existence filled with meaning, struggle, growth, and achievement preferable to an eternal existence in complete stasis? The game does not answer this question for you. It merely asks it, over and over, through its narrative structure, its cyclical nature, and the choices it offers. The flame remains the central mystery and symbol of Dark Souls. It is not a thing you can fully understand or control. It is a force that shapes history, births meaning, and inevitably leads to ending. The flame is the condition of possibility for everything that follows. All the kingdoms, all the struggles, all the meaning that will ever exist in this world. And yet it is also a flame. It will burn down. That is not a tragedy unique to this world. It is the nature of fire itself. The only question that remains for those who come after is what you will do while the flame still burns. The first flame did not bring a permanent end to the ancient darkness. It brought instead a rhythm, a cycle. This is perhaps the most profound insight that Dark Souls offers about the nature of existence itself. There are no permanent victories, only temporary dominions punctuated by inevitable returns to balance. The age of fire cannot last forever, and when it dims, the dark rises again. But the dark, when it fully emerges, is not eternal either. Eventually the flame returns, and the cycle repeats. This cyclical philosophy represents something different from both Western concepts of linear progress and Eastern concepts of eternal recurrence. The cycle of fire and dark in Dark Souls is not a perfect circle. Each cycle is slightly different. The flame that is rekindled is never quite as strong as the previous one. The kingdoms that rise are never quite as glorious. The beings who kindle the flame grow progressively more hollow, more diminished, until at last it becomes unclear whether the flame is being maintained or merely held at bay by sheer force of will. The Age of Fire, begun by Gwyn and his lords, was a time of growth, hierarchy, structure, and meaning. Kingdoms rose, art flourished, gods walked among men. But it was also an age of struggle, conflict, and the displacement of the ancient world. The dragons were driven nearly to extinction. The rest of the world was brought under the dominion of the Fireborn, the Golden Ones who had claimed pieces of the flame. This was not a peaceful transition. The ancient order was violently overthrown, not because the new order was inherently better, but because it possessed power the old order could not match. As the Age of Fire continued, the flame began to fade. This was not due to any single failure or sin, but rather because it is the nature of fire to burn down. Those who had kindled and maintained the flame found their task becoming increasingly burdensome. The flame required constant tending, constant sacrifice. Each lord who tried to maintain it found themselves diminished by the effort. Eventually, when the flame burned too low, the age would end. The fire would not go out completely, not yet, but it would dim enough that other forces could emerge. The dark is not evil. This is crucial. In the moral framework that typically characterizes fantasy games, dark is usually opposed to light as good is opposed to evil. But in Dark Souls, the dark is more fundamental and more complex than a simple evil force. Dark represents what exists when the flame is not touched, what remains potential and undetermined. Where the fire imposes order, structure, and predetermined meaning, the dark allows for chaos, potential, and freedom from predetermined form. When the Age of Fire fades and the dark begins to rise again, it is not a triumph of evil over good. It is a return of balance, a reassertion of the principle that was suppressed by the fire. The world cannot remain forever in the light of the flame. To imagine it could is to imagine that change itself has ended, that the process of becoming has stopped. But the world is fundamentally dynamic. What is must become something else. What has been built must decay. What was new must become old. Humanity plays a unique role in this cycle. Humans appear in the lore as beings born from darkness, carrying within them the dark soul or pieces of it. They were not chosen by the flame. They were not lords or gods. They were diminished beings, small, fragile, and yet possessed of something unique. The capacity for rapid change, for adaptation, for propagation. Where the dragon is eternal and unchanging, humanity is ephemeral and multiplying. Where the ancient order was ruled by those who could grasp the flame's fire, a new order emerged where humans, small and dark and numerous, became increasingly prominent. This suggests that the cycle naturally favours those who are most aligned with the current phase. In the Age of Fire, those closest to the flame prospered, the golden gods and their kingdoms. But as the Age of Fire fades and the dark rises again, those who carry the dark within themselves become increasingly powerful and numerous. Humanity's rise is not a conquest, but a natural consequence of the cycle's turning. The Age of Fire was an age of gods and lords. The age that follows may be an age of humans, darker, smaller, but filled with the deep potential of the dark. Each age has its own aesthetics, its own moral logic, its own understanding of what is beautiful and good. In the Age of Fire, the light is good. The Golden Order is just. Fire is life and progress and civilization. But in the dark, these values invert. The rigid order of fire becomes oppressive. The inevitable inequality of light-born versus dark-born becomes a wound to be addressed. The eternal struggle to maintain the flame becomes a burden that corrupts those who bear it. Neither perspective is objectively true. Each is simply the way the world looks from within its particular age. The player, throughout the Dark Souls games, encounters the tail end of the Age of Fire. The flame is dying. The kingdoms built in its light are crumbling. The gods are either dead or dying or slowly hollowing away. The player encounters messages left behind by the last knights of the Old Order, cryptic and confused, trying to maintain a world that is clearly ending. The bonfires, those monuments of the Age of Fire, still glow and offer respite, but they too are growing fewer and dimmer as the age wanes. The great irony of Dark Souls is that the player, typically encouraged by the game's narrative to save the world or restore order, is actually invited to participate in precisely the opposite. Every major choice the player makes hastens the end of the Age of Fire. Killing lords weakens the flame. Gathering souls to kindle it yourself means you, in turn, will be hollowed by the burden. Even the seemingly noble act of preventing the undead from hollowing and becoming mindless, zombies is itself a form of maintaining order, which requires the flame's light. The game's endings, which vary based on the player's choices, do not offer a clear good outcome. In some endings, the player rekindles the flame, potentially ensuring another cycle, but at great personal cost, and with the knowledge that this flame too will burn down. In others, the player abandons the effort and allows the flame to fade fully, which may usher in either a new age of dark or simply a period of emptiness and transition. The game offers no salvation in the traditional sense, no victory where the world is restored to perfection. What Dark Souls proposes instead is acceptance of the cycle. The philosophy is not one of progress toward a final good state, nor is it one of despair at inevitable decline. Rather, it is a philosophy of participation in the turning of ages, understanding that each age has its virtue and its corruption. and that the cycle itself is the only permanence. To live is not to win or to lose, but to exist within a particular moment of the cycle, aware of what came before and what will come after. This connects to concepts found in various philosophical traditions. The Hindu concept of endless cycles of creation and destruction, the Taoist understanding of complementary forces in eternal balance, the Greek idea of eternal recurrence, all of these find echoes in Dark Souls philosophy. The game refuses the linear narrative of Western progress and redemption, instead offering something more ancient and perhaps more honest. The world turns, ages rise and fall, and meaning is found not in the outcome but in participation itself. This cycle is not conscious. There is no cosmic intelligence directing it toward justice or progress. The fire does not rise because good has triumphed. It merely rises because that is what fires do when they have burned down far enough. The dark does not rise because evil is strong. It simply returns because the fire cannot burn forever. This gives Dark Souls a philosophical rigor that most games lack. The world does not exist for the player's benefit. The player exists within the world as it is, with all its indifference and beauty. Understanding this cycle changes how we interpret even small moments in the game. A bonfire offers respite and salvation, but it also marks the ongoing attempt to maintain a fading age. The undead curse that prevents the player from truly dying can be read as tragic, or as liberating, depending on one's perspective. The hollowing that threatens all undead represents the cost of immortality, the way that eternal life without change or growth becomes a kind of death anyway. The cycle of fire and dark is thus the central truth that all other elements of Dark Souls mythology revolve around. It is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be understood and accepted. The game's genius lies in making this abstract philosophical principle both intellectually interesting and emotionally resonant. As the player sits at a bonfire, watching embers glow in the darkness, they are literally sitting within the game's central metaphor. The bonfire is fire in darkness. It is temporary. It will burn down. But for now it burns, and that is enough. The undead curse is described in the lore as a plague, a condition that marks its victims and makes them pariahs in society. An undead being cannot truly die. When killed, they resurrect at the last bonfire where they rested. This seems, at first glance, like a blessing. Immortality is what heroes in countless myths and legends have sought. Yet in Dark Souls, undeath is presented as a curse, a condition that leads ultimately to hollowing, the complete loss of sense of self, purpose, and will. To understand this curse is to understand one of Dark Souls' most important philosophical insights. Meaning requires the possibility of ending. A being that cannot be truly killed will eventually lose any sense of purpose, any reason to continue existing. This is not magic in the traditional sense, but rather a reflection of a deep truth about consciousness and meaning. We act because we are mortal. We strive because resources are limited. We love because time is finite. Remove finitude and you do not create paradise. You create a slow deterioration of the self. The undead curse manifests as a gradual hollowing, a slow erosion of the personality and will of the cursed being. An undead who continues to wander without purpose will eventually become hollow, a shambling husk driven only by animal instinct and the remnants of old patterns. They become the basis for the game's hollow enemies, shambling enemies that attack on sight but without real intent, merely following programmed motions. This is perhaps the game's darkest statement, that meaning and purpose are so central to what makes us human that without them, our physical survival becomes a kind of living death. The undead curse befalls the player at the game's beginning, and the player must live with this knowledge throughout their journey. Death offers no escape, no rest, no finality. There is no peaceful ending to the undead curse except through the constant effort to maintain purpose and will. The game is, in this sense, a meditation on what keeps a being choosing to exist, what prevents us from hollowing out. For many undead in the game's world, the answer is a choice to kindle the flame, to become unkindled, to pursue some objective that gives meaning to their existence. These undead who have managed to maintain their humanity and purpose are the ones who still demonstrate intelligence, cunning, and will. They are the ones who can be talked to, who have goals and plans. They are the ones, like the player character, who have found or constructed some reason to continue existing despite the curse. This inverts the typical fantasy hero's journey. The hero is not trying to save the world because they have been chosen by destiny or blessed by fate. They are trying to save the world or kindle the flame or complete some other task because without that task they will hollow out and cease to be themselves. The quest itself is not external to the hero. It is the thing that keeps the hero from becoming nothing. To abandon the quest is not to lose the chance at glory. It is to surrender to hollowing, to choose a slow dissolution of self. This understanding raises profound questions about the nature of human existence. In our own world, we're all undead in a sense. We're all mortal beings aware of our mortality, and yet we must construct meaning and purpose to keep ourselves from despair. We must choose to continue existing, to pursue goals, to find purpose in a universe that does not guarantee any of these things. The undead curse is simply a literalization of the human condition itself. The curse also raises the question of what counts as valid purpose. The game does not judge the undead for their chosen purposes. Some kindle the flame out of duty to an old order, some seek to prevent the age from changing out of fear or tradition. Others actively work to usher in the dark, believing it to be a preferable state. All of these are valid responses to the curse. The game does not say that one purpose is better than another. It only says that some purpose, any purpose strong enough to maintain the self, is preferable to hollowing. Interestingly, the game suggests that not all purposes are equally maintainable. Those who are trying to prevent change to maintain the Age of Fire as it was find themselves increasingly desperate and hollow. The game's NPC characters, who are most devoted to preserving the old order, are often the ones closest to complete hollowing. Meanwhile, those who have found purposes that align with the turning of the cycle, that accept change rather than resist it, seem to maintain their humanity more easily. This implies a second layer of philosophical insight. The beings most hollowed are often those whose purpose has become impossible. A knight whose purpose is to serve a lord who is dead, or dying, or clearly wrong, this knight is engaged in a struggle against reality itself. Their will, no matter how strong, is fighting against the inexorable turning of ages. It is as though the curse compounds for those whose purposes are futile or denied by reality itself. The game presents several examples of this. Artorias the Abyss Walker, whose story is told through environmental clues and boss battles, appears to have been caught in an impossible purpose, fighting against the abyss itself, a force that cannot truly be defeated, only contained. His end suggests not failure exactly, but the hollowing that comes from fighting a purpose that has no possible victory. He was undead, cursed to immortality, and yet he found no rest or ending to his struggle. Similarly, the gods and lords of the age, of fire as the player encounters them in the later stages of the game, are clearly hollow. They continue to go through the motions of their ancient roles, but without understanding, without genuine will, almost automatical. They have been kindled so many times, and the burden of maintaining the flame has been so great that they have lost themselves entirely. They are not evil, they are simply hollow, shells continuing patterns that have long since ceased to have meaning. The player, understanding this, faces a choice that is more profound than simply deciding whether to kindle the flame or let it fade. The player must choose whether to accept a purpose, and what that purpose should be. Choose a purpose that seems futile or doomed, and the path to hollowing is inevitable. But choose no purpose at all, and hollowing is immediate. The only way to maintain humanity and self is to choose a purpose one can believe in, can continue to pursue, even with awareness of its eventual futility or impossibility. This is where Dark Souls achieves a kind of tragic wisdom. It does not offer the comfort of false hopes or easy answers. It says that existence is meaningful, not because the universe guarantees meaning, but because beings choose to make certain things matter. The universe is indifferent. The flame will burn down regardless of who tends it. The cycle will turn regardless of one's beliefs. And yet, in the face of this, beings still choose to care, to strive, to create meaning. That choice itself, the act of choosing to make something matter when it need not matter, is the heroic act. The curse becomes, in this reading, an opportunity. Only because you cannot escape through death can you be forced to confront the question of what makes life worth living. For an immortal undead being, every moment requires justification. Every moment must be chosen. This is presented not as a burden, though it is, but as a kind of freedom. The immortal undead cannot rely on the default purposes and meanings that the living accept without thinking. They must actively construct and maintain their own meaning. In the game's mechanics themselves, this philosophy is encoded. Death in Dark Souls is not a game over, not a failure state that ends the narrative. Death is just another loop, another return to the bonfire, another chance to continue the attempt. The game practically forbids despair, because despair would lead to hollowing, and hollowing would lead to the loss of agency itself. The player is mechanically forced to continue to try, to continue to pursue their purpose, or to construct a new one if the old one becomes impossible. The undead curse thus teaches that the search for meaning is not a luxury or an optional element of life. It is fundamental to remaining alive in any meaningful sense. A being without purpose does not simply become depressed or demotivated. They literally cease to be themselves, their identity dissolving as surely as their body would if they were fully killed. Meaning-making is not philosophy or ideology. It is survival. It is the essence of what keeps consciousness alive. The game ends not with a clear resolution to this question, but with the player's choice of which purpose to pursue, aware that all purposes are temporary, that all ages end, and that meaning is ultimately something constructed rather than discovered. And yet, knowing this, the player chooses anyway. They kindle the flame, or they let it fade. They choose a purpose. They choose to matter in a world that will ultimately not remember their choice. This is the deepest wisdom Dark Souls offers. That meaning is most beautiful and most real precisely because it is chosen freely, pursued knowingly against the backdrop of inevitable change and eventual ending. The gods of Dark Souls are not eternal beings. They're not creators of the world. They're not inherently deserving of worship or dominion. The gods are simply those beings who were fortunate, strong, or cunning enough to grasp pieces of the first flame when it kindled. This is a radical reframing of divinity. In traditional Western theology, gods are transcendent, eternal, and fundamentally separate from creation. In Dark Souls, the gods are contingent beings, products of circumstance and power, made divine by seizing fragments of the newly emerged flame. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, is presented as the greatest of these gods, the one who received the largest piece of the flame and used it to establish the Age of Fire and his kingdom. Yet even Gwyn is revealed, in the depths of the game, to be a being slowly consumed by his own flame. The player encounters him not at the height of his power, but near the end of the Age of Fire, a hollow shell of himself, repeating the same patterns of combat without consciousness or will. His divinity, so overwhelming in the lore and in the game's world, proves to be a temporary condition, not an eternal truth. This is a profound philosophical statement about the nature of power and authority. That which seems eternal and unchangeable, that which we are, taught to revere and worship, is often simply the product of historical contingency combined with power. The gods ruled not because they were fundamentally more worthy or wise than other beings, but because they seized power first and had the strength to maintain it. Their authority was real and consequential, but not divinely justified in any transcendent sense. The Age of Fire established by the gods was presented as the natural, the just, the eternal order. Kingdoms were built according to this order, laws were established, hierarchies were formalized, the gods and their chosen champions, the knights of their orders, the lords of their kingdoms, occupied the highest positions. Those born in darkness like humanity occupied lower positions, treated as strange and inferior beings. The entire structure of society was justified by appeal to the divine will of the gods and the natural order they supposedly embodied. Yet the game reveals this order to be a construct, beautiful and complex certainly, but ultimately artificial. It was created by choice and force, not by any natural law. It was maintained through the constant effort of those who benefited from it, and like all things created and maintained by effort, it eventually weakens. As the gods grow older and the flame begins to fade, the order they established begins to crack. Seemingly eternal becomes clearly temporary. The tragedy of the old order is that so many beings invested their entire purpose in maintaining it. Ornstein and Smaug, the guards of the gods, continue their duty long after the gods they served have effectively abandoned them. The Silver Knights defend their cathedrals though they have seen no new god-sent orders in ages. The order was so complete, so thoroughly internalized, that even when it became clear the flame was dying, beings continued to defend it out of sheer habit and loss of ability to imagine an alternative. This invites us to question all systems of order and authority that we are taught to see as natural or inevitable. Dark Souls suggest that such orders are always constructed, always maintained through the effort of those who benefit from them, and always ultimately temporary. The game does not argue against order itself. Some order is necessary for civilization to function. Rather, it argues against the belief that any particular order is eternal or divinely justified. The game presents alternative visions of order that arise as the Age of Fire wanes. The dark is not presented as mere chaos. The abyss is not simply the absence of structure. Rather, different orders emerge that are more aligned with the dark. These orders are no more true or natural than the order of the Age of Fire. They are simply different arrangements of power and meaning that emerge when the conditions that supported the previous order no longer exist. What is particularly sophisticated about Dark Souls' treatment of this theme is that it does not present the new orders as better than the old. A new age does not mean progress or improvement, it means change. Some beings will thrive in the new order, others will suffer. The hierarchies may be inverted, those who were low may rise. but they are still hierarchies. The cycle turns, but it does not necessarily improve. It merely becomes what it must become given the constraints of the moment. The game's NPCs provide numerous examples of how individuals relate to these changing orders. Some cling desperately to the old order, refusing to accept that the age is ending. These beings tend to become the most hollow, their purposes rendered impossible, their identities entirely dependent on a system that no longer works. Others move more flexibly, adjusting their purposes and allegiances as the cycle turns. These beings maintain their humanity more successfully, though at the cost of seeming to lack conviction or loyalty. Then there are those who consciously work to hasten the end of the old order and usher in a new one. These beings are not necessarily more virtuous or wise, but they are aligned with the direction the cycle is moving. The game does not present this as admirable exactly, but as adaptive. One could say they are simply riding the wave of inevitable change rather than fighting against it. The primordial serpents, mysterious entities that appear throughout the series, represent a kind of counterpower to the God Order. They offer other choices, other futures. They promise the dark, the void, freedom from the tyranny of fire. Yet the game presents them with ambiguity. Are they liberators or merely agents of a different order, equally constructed and equally temporary? The game refuses to say. It merely presents them as an alternative, neither good nor evil, but different. One of the most profound philosophical statements the game makes is that the illusion of eternal order is actually necessary for civilization. The gods and their order were lies, beautiful lies, but lies nonetheless. Yet without these lies, without the belief that the order was eternal and just, would the kingdoms have been built? Would art and culture have flourished? The question Dark Souls poses is whether civilization requires false consciousness, whether the illusion of permanence and divine justification is necessary to motivate beings to build and create and maintain. The game does not clearly answer this. Some characters suggest that yes, beings need to believe in an eternal order, even if that belief is false. Others suggest that a society could be built on honest acknowledgement of change and temporality. Still others suggest that it does not matter. What matters is what you build while you are here. Knowing that it will eventually be lost, this connects to a broader, philosophical tradition questioning the nature of consciousness and whether truth is always preferable to useful falsehood. Dark Souls does not advocate for either position. It simply explores the question through its narrative and mechanics. The player is forced to grapple with the knowledge that the order they might help restore is ultimately false, yet also understand why other beings have devoted their entire existence to maintaining it. The gods of Dark Souls in the end are simply powerful beings who happen to gain more power than others when the first flame kindled. They were fortunate, they were strong, they were clever, but they were not fundamentally different in kind from other beings. They could be killed, they could be hollowed, they could be forgotten. Their divine authority was real because beings believed in it and enforced it, but it had no metaphysical foundation, no eternal truth behind it. This brings Dark Souls philosophy into conversation with thinkers like Nietzsche, who argued that divinity is a human creation rather than a discovered truth, or theorists of power like Foucault, who argued that what we experience as natural order is actually constructed through systems of power. The game, without preaching or directly advocating for any particular philosophy, invites the player to think about the basis of authority, the nature of order, and the relationship between power and truth. By the time the player encounters the gods in the game's later stages, they are being asked to question whether defeating them is liberation or destruction, Whether the order they created was just or merely powerful, the game provides no clear answers, only the opportunity to choose what one believes about these fundamental questions and to act accordingly. The player can protect the old order, hastening the hollow persistence of a dying age. The player can usher in the dark, allowing new orders to emerge. The player can stand outside both camps, refusing commitment to either. All these choices are available, and none is clearly right. The philosophy is not nihilistic. It does not say that nothing matters because all orders are equally false. Rather, it says that what matters is not whether the order is eternal or true, but what we choose to do within the time we have, knowing that all orders are constructed, temporary, and ultimately contingent on forces beyond any individual's control. In the lore of Dark Souls, humanity is presented as an anomaly, an accident born from the darkness that the flame did not touch. When the first flame kindled and its light touched the world, the dragons received the light and became lords of the ancient world in a new form. The gods who grasped pieces of the flame became divine and eternal, but humanity emerged from what was left, from the untouched dark, and carried within themselves something the other races did not, the dark soul, or fragments of it. Humanity in Dark Souls is not presented as the pinnacle of creation, or even as particularly noble. Humans are small, fragile, mortal beings compared to the ancient dragons or the radiant gods. They carry mortality as a fundamental part of their nature. They are vulnerable to hollowing like any other undead, yet they possess something unique, an unusual capacity for rapid change, for growth, for multiplication, and for claiming pieces of the world that were not initially theirs. Humanity rises not through strength or nobility, but through adaptability and the simple fact that there are many of them. The Dark Soul is presented in the lore as something fundamental, possibly even more fundamental than the first flame itself. Some games in the series suggest that the Dark Soul may have existed before the flame, that it may have been the source from which the flame itself arose. If this is true, then humanity's relationship to the dark is not a disadvantage, but an ancient inheritance, a connection to something that precedes even divinity itself. This inverts the hierarchy suggested by the Age of Fire, where humanity was treated as inferior to the Fireborn. The mechanics of the game reflect this philosophical relationship between humanity and the dark. The player character, like all undead, slowly hollows when they die. But humanity items exist in the game's world, physical items that can be claimed and used to restore the player's humanity, to reverse hollowing. This is not presented as a magical cure, but as a literal substance, something that can be consumed to restore what was lost. The implication is that humanity is not a permanent state, but a condition that must be actively maintained and replenished. Furthermore, humanity exists in the game as a hidden stat. The player has a visible number indicating their physical level and strength, but humanity is tracked separately, hidden, a secret that players must discover. It accumulates slowly and is lost every time the player dies. To maintain humanity in the world of Dark Souls is to go against the natural tendency toward hollowing. It requires effort, the consumption of resources, and constant vigilance. To be human in this world is to resist entropy. This suggests a profound philosophical insight. Humanity, or what we might call the self, is not a permanent or stable thing. It is something that must be continuously reconstructed and maintained. Every human being faces a kind of slow hollowing from the moment of birth. Our sense of self is constantly threatened by time, loss, trauma, and the simple entropy of existence. To maintain humanity, To remain a coherent self with desires and purposes and a sense of individual identity requires constant effort and renewal. The process of hollowing describes what happens when one ceases to maintain that effort. The hollow ones in Dark Souls are not evil beings who have chosen darkness. They are beings who have lost the motivation to maintain themselves, who have given up on the effort of being human, and in doing so have lost their humanity. They continue to exist, to move and act, but without understanding, without purpose, without the sense of self that makes one human. They become mechanical, driven by base instincts and the echo of old patterns. This is a subtle but important distinction. The game does not present hollowing as a curse imposed from outside. It is the natural result of a being ceasing to maintain its own humanity. It is what happens when you stop trying. One could say that hollowing is not something done to you, but something you choose, through the passive choice of not choosing to maintain yourself. This places responsibility for one's own hollowing on the being who hollows, while also suggesting that this responsibility is an unbearable burden for many. The game presents many examples of beings who have failed this responsibility. The hollow soldiers, the hollow warriors, the increasingly hollow lords of the old order, all are examples of beings who were once human, or were once the equivalent in their race, and who have lost that condition through the slow degradation of effort and will. Some of these beings are tragic figures, ones we can sympathize with in their loss. Others are presented as almost pathetic, demonstrating the emptiness that results when the effort to be ceases. Humanity in Dark Souls is also closely linked to the concept of souls. Souls are both experience points that allow the player to level up, and the fundamental substance that constitutes consciousness and will in this world. To lose your soul in combat is to lose experience points, but also to literally lose a piece of yourself, a portion of your ability to be. Gathering souls is gathering the raw material of existence itself. This is why souls are so central to the game's mechanics and narrative. They are not merely currency, they are literally the substance that makes beings exist. The primordial serpents speak of souls and the dark soul in ways that suggest humanity's unique position. Humans seem to be naturally aligned with the dark soul in ways that other beings are not. As the age of fire wanes and beings become weaker without access to the flame's light, humans seem to grow naturally stronger, as if finally entering an age for which they were always suited. This suggests that humanity is not a lesser form of being, but a different form, one that will rise and become more prominent as the cycle turns. The game invites speculation that the next age, the age after the Age of Fire, might be the age of humanity, the age of dark, in which humans rise to prominence as beings adapted to what comes naturally in darkness. This would not be presented as a utopia or an improvement over the Age of Fire. It would simply be a different arrangement, one in which different beings thrive and different orders are possible. One of the most philosophically interesting aspects of humanity in Dark Souls is how it relates to choice and freedom. The Fireborn, the gods and dragons of the Age of Fire, seem to have less choice in their nature. They are bound by their fire, their immortality, their rigid hierarchies. Humans, by contrast, seem more fluid. They are not bound by tradition in the same way. They can change allegiances more easily. They can adopt new purposes. This fluidity is presented as both a strength and a kind of rootlessness. The game suggests that to be human is to exist in a state of fundamental uncertainty about one's nature. The Fireborn know what they are. The gods know their purpose. But humans must continually discover and create their own nature and purpose. This is more freedom, perhaps, but also more burden. The game does not suggest that this greater freedom makes humans happier or better. It merely makes them different, better adapted to an age of change and darkness. The hollow state, then, becomes a particular danger for humans. For a fireborn being, the danger of hollowing is a catastrophic loss of an eternal nature. For a human, the danger of hollowing is a loss of the effort of self-creation. For a human, to hollow is to stop choosing what you will be and to lapse into some default state of mechanical existence. This might be why the player character, presented as human or as close to human as possible, is the one being who can maintain the greatest will and determination despite hollowing. Humans, born in darkness and without an eternal nature given to them, are perhaps most suited to choosing what they will be, to maintaining identity through sheer will. The relationship between humanity and the flame itself is also significant. Humans receive only the smallest pieces of the flame, if any. They are not naturally fireborn, yet they can gather pieces of the flame through their travels and conquests, and they can kindle the flame if given the chance. This suggests that humanity's relationship to the flame is more tenuous, but also more genuine. A fireborn being kindles the flame almost automatically. It is their nature. A human kindles the flame through conscious choice, knowing they are not naturally suited to it, choosing to maintain it anyway through sheer will. Some interpretations of the lore suggest that this human choice to kindle the flame is ultimately more powerful than the natural fire kindling of the gods. A being that kindles the flame against their nature, that maintains it despite being diminished by it, demonstrates a will that perhaps surpasses even the will of the gods. This could explain why the humans in Dark Souls' world are treated with such ambivalence by those in power. Humans are feared not because they are strong, but because they are unpredictable. They choose, they create. They are not bound by the natural orders that constrain other races. The philosophy of humanity in Dark Souls ultimately suggests that to be human is to be burdened with freedom, uncertain of one's nature, and required to constantly recreate oneself. It is harder than being born divine or eternal. But it also allows for a kind of authenticity and genuine will that perhaps divine beings cannot achieve. The human character in Dark Souls, surviving and thriving despite being undead, despite carrying the dark within themselves, despite being treated as lesser, demonstrates something profound. That identity and meaning are achievements, not gifts. To be human is to make yourself human, again and again, moment by moment. Beyond the reach of the first flame, in the deepest places beneath the world, exists something that the lore only hints at and never fully explains: the abyss. The abyss is not merely darkness, it is something more primal, something that predates even the ancient order of the dragons. It is presented as a void, a deep emptiness that exists where the flame has not touched. Some characters in the lore speak of it with terror, others speak of it with temptation. All treat it as something fundamentally other, something that cannot be easily categorized as good or evil, but simply as a force and a presence that exists outside the normal order. The nature of the abyss is deliberately obscured by the game. The player encounters it gradually, through hints and glimpses and suggestions. Manus, the father of the abyss, is presented as a tragic figure, a being that was consumed or transformed by contact with the abyss. Artorius, the knight who attempted to stand against the abyss, is presented as a noble warrior, driven to ultimate tragedy by his futile struggle. The game suggests that the abyss is not something that can be defeated, only contained, and that even containing it comes at great cost. The abyss seems to corrupt or transform that which touches it. In Dark Souls 3, the player encounters beings that have been touched by the abyss. warped and twisted into monstrous forms. Yet these beings are not evil in any simple sense. They are beings who have been altered, changed by contact with the force that lies outside the normal categories of existence. The corruption is not moral but ontological. They have been changed in what they fundamentally are. One of the most profound insights that the Abyss suggests is that there are limits to the fire's domain. The flame brought order, structure, and meaning, but these are not universal. There are regions where the flame's light does not reach, where the old stasis was never broken, where something else might exist. The Abyss represents both the deep past, the world before the flame, and the possible future, the state that might emerge if the flame were to fade completely. The philosophical implications are profound. If the flame created time, meaning, and order, what is the Abyss? Is it the absence of these things, a return to the eternal moment of the Age of Ancients? Or is it something else entirely, a different kind of existence that is neither time nor timelessness, neither order nor chaos, but something that cannot be understood through the categories established by the flame? The game refuses to answer, suggesting that the Abyss might be fundamentally incomprehensible from within a consciousness shaped by the flame. Some of the most interesting characters in the series are those who have understood or accepted the Abyss to some degree. The primordial serpents, those mysterious beings who offer alternative paths and choices, seem to have knowledge of and connection to the Abyss. They tempt players with promises of power and alternatives to the rule of the gods. They do not openly serve the Abyss, but they seem aligned with forces that oppose the fire's dominion. Their nature suggests that opposition to the fire's order need not come in the form of the Abyss itself, but could be a kind of wisdom or knowledge that accepts the Abyss's existence. The deepest philosophical question the Abyss raises is whether the flame's order is preferable to whatever would emerge from contact with or acceptance of the Abyss. The game never suggests this is a simple question. The Age of Fire was beautiful and creative and full of meaning, but it was also built on hierarchy, conflict, and the displacement of the ancient order. A world touched by the Abyss might be incomprehensible and terrifying, but it might also be free from the constraints and corruptions of the fire's rule. In Dark Souls 3, a late-game character speaks of spreading the Abyss, of allowing it to embrace the world. This character is presented not as straightforwardly evil, but as holding a vision of the world that is simply different. They believe that the Abyss offers liberation from the false order of the fire. The player must decide whether to oppose them or to consider their perspective. The game does not judge this choice morally. It presents both the Abyss spreading and the fire kindling as meaningful but conflicting visions of what the world should become. The Abyss also raises questions about knowledge and understanding. There are beings in the series whose understanding extends to the Abyss, who have learned its secrets. But this knowledge seems to come at a cost. It appears to fragment the mind, to create a kind of enlightenment that is simultaneously a form of dissolution. To understand the Abyss seems to be to partially become it, to allow the deep void to reshape one's consciousness. This suggests that there are kinds of knowledge that cannot be integrated into a human consciousness without destroying that consciousness. The game's treatment of the Abyss connects to existential philosophy and the concept of the void or nothingness. Philosophers like Heidegger spoke of being and nothingness as fundamental categories, and the experience of nothingness as something that could provoke anxiety and wonder. The Abyss in Dark Souls seems to function similarly. It is the nothingness that lies beyond or beneath being, the void that the Order of the Fire keeps at bay. To acknowledge the Abyss is to acknowledge that the world of meaning and order that the fire created is not eternal or fundamental, but contingent. built on top of something darker and more primal. The terror of the abyss is partly the terror of recognizing that meaning is fragile, that the order we depend on is not natural or necessary. This is not a unique terror to Dark Souls, but rather a general existential terror that humans have always felt when contemplating the possibility that the world we inhabit is not stable or certain. The abyss represents this terror made literal, a force that threatens to overturn everything we understand as real and meaningful. Yet the game also suggests that some degree of acceptance or knowledge of the abyss might be necessary for true understanding. Those characters who refuse to acknowledge the abyss at all often prove to be incomplete in their understanding. Those who acknowledge it and try to fight it sometimes achieve a kind of nobility, even in defeat. And those who have learned to exist in relationship with it, neither entirely dominated by the fire nor consumed by the abyss, seem to possess a kind of wisdom. The abyss also raises questions about expansion and what lies beyond known boundaries. Throughout human history, frontiers have been both enticing and terrifying. The abyss functions as a kind of ultimate frontier, a boundary that cannot be crossed without transformation. To enter the abyss is to move beyond the realm of meaning and order into something fundamentally other. This might be freedom, or it might be annihilation. The game refuses to say which, or whether the distinction even makes sense. One of the most profound suggestions the game makes is that the abyss might be growing. In Dark Souls 3, there are hints that the abyss is expanding, that it is consuming more of the world, that its creeping presence is inevitable. This suggests that the fire's order, which kept the abyss at bay, is weakening, and as it does, the deep void reasserts itself. This is not presented as a catastrophe to be prevented, but as a natural consequence of the cycle. As the fire burns down, the abyss rises. This is not good or evil, but inevitable. This connects back to the cyclical philosophy of Dark Souls. Just as the fire rises and falls, the abyss waxes and wanes. The Age of Fire was an age in which the flame's light pushed back the abyss, creating order and meaning. But as the fire fades, the abyss returns. The next age, whenever it comes, may be an age in which the abyss holds sway, in which the deep void shapes reality. This would not be a destruction of the world, but a transformation, a different arrangement of what is possible and meaningful. The player's encounters with the abyss throughout the series suggest that it is not something that can be fully understood or overcome, only negotiated with. Those who attempt to completely defeat the abyss, like Artorias, ultimately fail and are consumed or destroyed. Those who acknowledge it and maintain vigilance against it can perhaps survive for longer. But ultimate victory against the abyss is never presented as possible. It is a force as fundamental as the fire itself, and like the fire, it operates according to its own logic, not according to human wishes or moral judgments. By the time the player has engaged with the abyss across multiple games, a certain perspective begins to emerge. The choice is not between good and evil, between fire and abyss, but between understanding and ignorance, between acknowledging the deep void that underlies existence and attempting to deny it. The abyss cannot be destroyed, and attempting to do so is futile and corrupting, but neither can it be embraced entirely without losing oneself. The only wisdom is to navigate between them, to understand both the necessity of the fire's order and the reality of the void that underlies it. This is perhaps the game's most sophisticated philosophical insight, that reality consists of both order and chaos, meaning and void, light and darkness, and that maturity consists not in choosing one absolutely, but in understanding both and maintaining equilibrium. The abyss is not evil. It is simply the truth that lies beneath the fire's order, that beneath all order is emptiness, that all meaning is contingent, and that reality is fundamentally more vast and more indifferent than our understanding can encompass. To understand the abyss is to understand the limits of understanding itself, and to accept that some mysteries cannot be solved, only lived alongside.